They told you Atlantis was just a myth, a fantasy drowned beneath the ocean floor. But what if that was the lie? What if it was buried to keep you from remembering who you truly are? Because this isn't just about a lost city. It's about memory. It's about what was taken, not by nature, but by design. And why your soul may be one of the few that still carries the code. What if Atlantis didn't sink beneath water, but beneath consciousness? Not lost, but hidden in the psyche of a world trained to forget. Stay with this, because before this ends, you'll understand why this message found you. Why that restlessness in your chest, that feeling that something's missing, isn't imagination, it's remembrance. The breath deepens, the light swells, the music shifts. We begin to move through shadows, symbols, and silent ruins. They called it a legend, a cautionary tale, a beautiful fiction woven from the imagination of an ancient philosopher. That was the first layer of forgetting, not by accident, but by design. Because if they could convince you Atlantis was a myth, they could keep you from ever looking deeper. And if you never looked deeper, you'd never realize that the story wasn't just about a city. It was about you. Atlantis wasn't lost in the sea. It was buried in the psyche, hidden beneath centuries of distraction, distortion, and deliberate denial. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. Atlantis was a mirror, a reflection of human potential at its highest vibration and its greatest fall. A civilization where technology and consciousness worked as one, where energy flowed through intention, where the material and the spiritual were not separate paths, but one unified current. And that memory, that truth, lives inside you still. But they couldn't let you remember that. So they told you it was a fairy tale, something between unicorns and utopias, an imaginary continent swallowed by waves in a single night, a fable to entertain, not a truth to awaken. They used Plato's name to neutralize his power. But what they never told you is that Plato wasn't inventing, he was remembering. Passed down from Egyptian priests, carried through the bloodline of ancient initiates, encoded in symbols, stories, and structures. The knowledge of Atlantis was preserved, not in the open, but in the hidden, not in textbooks, but in temples. And in time, even those temples fell silent, because if people remembered what Atlantis really was, if they remembered the frequency it held, they would begin to question everything. They would ask why modern life feels so artificial, why our deepest instincts are ridiculed, why the systems we live in feel hollow, cold, disconnected from something sacred, and most dangerously, they would begin to remember how powerful they actually are. You see, the truth was never erased. It was covered, buried beneath noise, distracted by spectacle, wrapped in ridicule so no one would go looking. But there are some who still feel it, that ache in the soul, that sense that we've done this before, that we've built something greater and lost it. If you're one of them, this isn't the first time you've heard this story. Not really. You're not just discovering Atlantis, you're reawakening it, because the myth they fed you was a lock, and what's rising now is the key. And when that key turns, the remembering begins. There's a reason the word Atlantis makes something shift inside you. Not just curiosity, but memory. That word carries weight, and not because of history books, but because of resonance. From the first time you heard it, maybe as a child, maybe last week, it didn't land like an ordinary name. It echoed. It rang like a bell in some ancient part of you that language forgot. But the soul did not. Atlantis, it's not just a word. It's a vibration, one that stretches across lifetimes, a frequency encoded with truth and buried beneath centuries of distortion. For some, it's just a story, but for others, it feels like home. It's the way your chest tightens when you hear it spoken softly, the way your dreams shift when you read about it before sleep, the way it stirs something you can't explain and don't need to. Because this isn't about understanding, it's about remembering. Words have power, and this one was designed to be forgotten. That's why they turned it into fantasy, because if people knew what it truly meant, if they felt the pull in their blood, they might start to question the stories they've been fed. They might begin to feel what you feel, that this world, this system, this life we've been taught to accept is missing something. Something ancient, something beautiful, something lost, not to time, but to amnesia. Because Atlantis is not just a place, it's a frequency, a spiritual state, a way of being that once existed and now lingers like a phantom in the human soul. You don't remember it in the mind, you remember it in the ache, in the stillness, in that moment when you're alone and everything else fades and a knowing rises from the silence. The truth is, you've never been separate from it. You've just been taught not to trust the part of you that knows, but the memory is returning. That's what this is, not a teaching, a triggering, not a lesson, but a key. And that key has always been the name, Atlantis. It was never just a legend, it was a message, and you're finally ready to hear it again. They say Plato imagined Atlantis, but Plato never claimed that. He said it was history, not a metaphor, not a myth, a real place, a real civilization, and more than that, a warning. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he speaks not as a creator, but as a messenger. He tells us the story came from his ancestor Solon, one of the great lawmakers of ancient Athens, a man who traveled to Egypt in search of wisdom, who was welcomed by the priests of Sais, and who was told that the Greeks had forgotten who they once were, forgotten what came before, forgotten the age of Atlantis. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were like children, wise in speech, but lacking memory, because the world had gone through many floods, many fires, many collapses, and each time, history was lost. But not in Egypt, not in their temples of stone. They remembered. They told him of a powerful land beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, a continent larger than Libya and Asia combined, rich in spirit, advanced in knowledge, but corrupted by pride and destroyed by its own imbalance. Plato wasn't crafting a tale. He was recording a transmission, one that had survived across empires, across languages, across time. And yet, over centuries, scholars dismissed it, called it fiction, called it symbolism, called it a metaphor for utopia or for imperial Athens. But those dismissals ignored the precision in his account, the measurements, the timelines, the description of temples, canals, infrastructure, values, laws. Atlantis wasn't painted in broad strokes. It was drawn like a map. Even modern researchers like Dr. J.M. Allen, who explored the Altiplano region of Bolivia, and Ignatius Donnelly, who published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882, have asked the same question. Why would a philosopher of Plato's stature embed such meticulous detail into a lie? The answer is, he didn't. He remembered. Maybe not in the modern sense, maybe not as a direct witness, but through a lineage of memory, a chain of initiates, a frequency carried through the schools of thought, through Egypt, through Greece, and passed on to those who would listen. Because stories like this were never meant for the masses. They were seeds, planted in the minds of the ready. If Atlantis was real, then so was the fall. And if the fall was real, then so is the risk. Plato wasn't warning about the past. He was warning the future, our future. We read his words now through modern eyes. But some part of him may have been writing for you, because only some will feel it. And if you've made it this far, it means the memory is waking up, not just in history, but in you. Imagine a civilization not built on control, but on coherence, not driven by conquest, but aligned with cosmic law. Atlantis, in its true form, wasn't simply advanced, it was attuned. Its people didn't just study the world, they listened to it. They lived in rhythm with the stars, the tides, the breath of the earth. It wasn't a utopia, it was a harmonic culture where the spiritual and the scientific were not at odds, but part of the same language. Plato described Atlantis as a land ruled by kings who were half divine, not in blood, but in alignment. They governed according to the laws of Ma'at, balance, order, truth, a concept deeply rooted in both Egyptian and Hermetic teachings. Their temples weren't places to worship gods in fear. They were centers of frequency, structures calibrated through sacred geometry to amplify the energy of thought, intention, and sound. In the accounts of Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, Atlantis was a place where spiritual science flourished. Cayce spoke of crystal-powered energy, of levitation through sound, of healing chambers tuned to the vibratory fields of the body. He described Atlanteans as capable of materializing objects with focused thought. And while mainstream science still calls this fiction, quantum physics is catching up. Studies in cymatics show how sound organizes matter. Experiments in quantum coherence hint at the influence of consciousness over physical reality. What if Atlantis was never ahead of its time, but outside of time, operating from a dimension where thought, energy, and form were braided together, inseparable, intentional, divine? Their cities reflected this understanding, built in concentric circles like ripples on water, flowing from the center out, a sacred blueprint, not just functional, but symbolic. The outermost ring held the physical. The innermost held the temple, the spiritual heart. Every structure served a purpose. Every purpose served a principle. And the people, they lived with purpose. Education was not indoctrination, it was awakening. Children were taught not only math and language, but resonance, frequency, emotional alignment. They learned that their thoughts created patterns, that their emotions were instruments, that their bodies were vessels of light. Atlanteans knew the earth was alive. They didn't extract energy, they worked with it. They built with the flow of ley lines, the dragon veins of the planet. They understood that where you build is how you build, that where you speak determines what your words become. This wasn't magic, it was memory, technology guided by consciousness, power governed by wisdom. But that memory was dangerous to the world that came after. Because if people knew they once lived in that kind of harmony, they might begin to ask why they no longer do. And if they remembered that frequency, they might begin to feel it again. And when enough begin to feel it, Atlantis returns, not as a place, but as a state. And that is what they fear most. When people speak of the fall of Atlantis, They picture waves, earthquakes, volcanoes swallowing cities whole. And yes, the earth did tremble, the seas did rise, but the collapse didn't begin there. It began in the unseen, in the subtle realms, where frequency becomes intention, and intention shapes reality. The fall of Atlantis was not a natural disaster, it was a spiritual one. Plato said it clearly. The Atlanteans in the beginning lived in alignment with divine law. Their souls were luminous, their hearts were tethered to wisdom. They remembered their place in the great cosmic pattern. But over time, something shifted, not all at once, but slowly, gradually, until that subtle imbalance became a rupture. Ego crept in. Desire outpaced devotion. The sacred became strategic, and what was once used to harmonize was turned toward control. The tools of frequency, sound, crystal, vibration were no longer governed by the soul, but by the will. Power, once a means of service, became a weapon of dominance. The very technologies that had elevated them began to distort them. Edgar Cayce described it as a division between the sons of the law of one and the sons of Belial. One group sought to remain in harmony with divine consciousness. The other sought to manipulate, to rule, to possess. And the deeper they fell into separation, the more unstable the entire system became. Atlantean scientists, once seers and sages, began experimenting with forces they no longer fully understood. They attempted to force energy to bend to desire. They breached the veil between realms without reverence. They tampered with genetics, spirit, and matter, not to elevate, but to dominate. The balance broke, not because nature was cruel, but because nature reflects what we become. The floods, the fire, the thunder, they were the final echo, not the cause, but the consequence. A karmic balancing of frequencies long ignored. The earth didn't betray them. It responded to them, as it always does, as it still does. And so Atlantis fell, not because they were weak, but because they forgot who they were. They forgot the sacred order, the breath of the stars, the weight of intention, the responsibility of remembrance. The collapse was a mirror, and that mirror still stands, because if it happened once, it can happen again, and maybe it already is. When we value power over presence, when we trade coherence for convenience, when we forget the soul in pursuit of the self, we walk the same path they did, but this time we have the memory. And if we remember in time, the fall doesn't have to repeat, because what was lost through forgetting can only be reclaimed through awakening. The tools of Atlantis didn't hum with electricity. They vibrated with consciousness. What they built wasn't powered by wires, combustion, or code. It was powered by alignment. Every structure, every device, every symbol operated not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it. This wasn't technology in the modern sense. It was frequency. It was intention. It was resonance. Atlantean science was rooted in the principle that all is vibration, a truth echoed in Hermetic teachings and quantum mechanics alike. The Kybalion speaks of the principle of vibration, that nothing rests, that everything moves, everything vibrates. The ancients knew this not as theory, but as experience. They didn't extract energy from the earth. They worked with it. Crystals were not ornaments. They were living tools. Clear quartz, amethyst, and selenite were used not just for beauty, but for communication, healing, and energy transmission. According to Edgar Cayce's readings, The Atlanteans harnessed a central energy device, a firestone that directed cosmic forces, a crystalline transmitter, a resonant core, not for destruction, but for coherence. They understood that energy responds to consciousness, that sound, thought, and symbol were not separate disciplines, but one integrated language. Sound was a tool, geometry was a code, light was a carrier. They aligned their temples to planetary meridians, just as the Giza Plateau is aligned to Orion, not for decoration, for amplification. Earth was not a dead rock. It was a partner, a conscious grid of ley lines, nodes, and frequencies. Atlantis existed in harmony with this planetary web. They were stewards, not masters. Pyramids were not tombs. They were generators, frequency chambers, sacred power stations that tuned the human body to the divine field. Cymatics today shows us that sound creates shape. Geometric patterns in sand, water, matter. The Atlanteans used this truth to shape reality itself. They weren't coding software. They were coding light, coding vibration. They understood that intention, held in a coherent field, could move matter, that healing didn't require pills, but pattern. That disease was a distortion, and harmony was the cure. This wasn't fantasy. It was advanced spiritual science. The teachings of the Essenes, the chants of Tibetan monks, the mantras of Vedic texts. These are fragments, echoes of Atlantean tech, practices designed to restore vibration, to reset the field, to align the soul. But over time, this science was lost, or worse, it was twisted, used not to uplift, but to control. The same frequencies that once opened portals of awakening were redirected into devices of illusion, of sedation, of forgetting. And yet, the knowledge remains, hidden in your cells, in your breath, in your voice, because you are not separate from this technology. You are the technology. And the moment you begin to remember that, you don't just reclaim the past, you activate the future. To the Atlanteans, crystals weren't accessories. They were instruments, not passive objects, but conscious tools, living technologies, receivers, amplifiers, memory holders. They understood that each crystal had its own vibrational code, a resonance that could interact with thought, intention, and emotion. Clear quartz, for example, wasn't just beautiful, it was programmable. Even today, we use quartz in watches, radios, and microchips to regulate frequency. But Atlantis used it for far more. Crystals were the interface between consciousness and the physical world. Through focused thought and harmonic vibration, they could store information, emit energy, and tune the human body back into coherence. Edgar Cayce spoke of temples lined with crystals, places where healing occurred not through surgery, but through sound and light, tuned perfectly to the body's energetic blueprint. Sound was the primary tool, not noise, not random chants, but precise tonal sequences, mathematical and sacred, frequencies that could align the chakras, dissolve illness, even levitate objects. The ancients understood what modern science is only beginning to remember. That sound can move matter. Cymatic experiments show us this. Geometric patterns emerging from vibration, as if the universe itself were humming shape into being. In Atlantis, this was not a novelty. It was a foundation. They used resonance to open gateways between dimensions. They used mantras, like the sacred syllables in Sanskrit, or the tones of the solfeggio scale, to activate energy centers within the body. Their temples weren't places of worship in the way we understand today. They were calibration chambers, frequency sanctuaries, geometrically aligned to the stars and built using harmonic ratios that mirrored the divine structure of the cosmos. This is sacred geometry, the language of creation, the flower of life, the Vesica Piscis, the golden ratio. These weren't symbols, they were keys, codes to unlock harmony, growth, and multidimensional awareness. The layout of their cities, their temples, even their tools followed these patterns. As above, so below. As within, so without. The Atlanteans knew that every thought had a frequency. Every emotion created a ripple in the field. They lived in a world where energy was felt and understood, not denied or feared. And because of that, they built in ways we can no longer replicate. Not because we lacked the tools, but because we lost the intention. What they created was a mirror of inner alignment, a technology that responded not to force, but to presence, not to control, but to coherence. And when that coherence was broken, when ego overrode intention, these tools, once sacred, became unstable, the geometry distorted, the frequencies dissonant, and what once healed began to fracture. We live now in a world of noise, but the silence still holds the code, because the geometry never vanished. The crystals still wait, the sound still resonates, and all it takes is a remembering. It didn't happen all at once. The fall of Atlantis wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow inversion. A shift so subtle at first no one noticed. Because the tool still worked. The temple still glowed. The chants still echoed. But the energy behind them had changed. What was once offered in reverence was now taken in desire. Atlantean technology, once rooted in sacred alignment, became a means of domination. Sound frequencies, once used to recalibrate the body and soul, were now manipulated to override free will. Crystals, programmed to carry healing light, were recoded for surveillance, control, and even warfare. Edgar Cayce spoke of this. He described a split, a spiritual civil war between the sons of the law of one and the sons of Belial. The former still honored the divine blueprint. The latter sought to bend it. They took the sacred sciences and re-engineered them, not to serve consciousness, but to control it. And consciousness responded. The harmonics began to break down. The planetary grid became unstable. Reality itself started to fracture. These were not just tools, they were bridges between dimensions, between spirit and matter. And when they were misused, those bridges became unstable, like a circuit overloaded with the wrong intention, like a prayer spoken without the heart. Temples of light became chambers of power. Healing became hierarchy. Knowledge became control. The vibration of Atlantis dropped from unity to separation, from devotion to ambition, from service to supremacy. They had the same crystals, the same geometry, the same words, but they had forgotten the key: intention. Intention is the soul of all technology. It is the conductor behind every sound, every symbol, every structure. And when intention is corrupted, so is the system. The Atlanteans began to believe they were gods, not in essence, but in entitlement. They began experimenting with life itself, hybridizing species, tapping into interdimensional currents they no longer respected, attempting to harness the sun, the stars, the soul, without reverence for the law that binds it all. What they unlocked, they could no longer control. The frequency of the land shifted, the earth responded, and the countdown began. But this isn't just ancient history. This is a reflection, because we live in a world not so different, where tools of connection are used to isolate, where light is packaged as distraction, where power is sold as progress, but costs the soul. The Atlanteans didn't lose their knowledge. They lost their center. And without the center, everything spun out. The question is not whether they fell, it's whether we're repeating it. Because sacredness can never be destroyed, but it can be misused. And that misuse becomes the echo of every collapse. Before the seas rose, before the earthquakes shattered cities, before the temples were swallowed, Atlantis had already fallen. Not physically, spiritually. The collapse didn't begin with water. It began with forgetfulness, a slow erosion of truth, not in the text, but in the hearts of the people. They still spoke the words, they still stood in the temples, they still performed the rituals, but the fire behind their breath was gone. Because remembering is not about information, it's about frequency. And Atlantis began to forget what it meant to live in alignment. The values that once held the civilization together, humility, reverence, service, were replaced with hierarchy, vanity, and control. The divine spark that once infused every structure, every teaching, every vibration, dimmed. Not because it was taken, but because it was neglected. When Casey described the Atlantean fall, he spoke of a shift in consciousness, that those who once walked in unity began to divide, not just politically, but energetically. People began to look outside themselves for power, for validation, for purpose. And in doing so, they lost the inner temple. The earth did not retaliate. It reflected, as above, so below, as within, so without. The energetic field of Atlantis had fractured, and that fracture echoed into the land. The ley lines became unstable, the crystal grids misaligned. Sacred structures built on perfect geometry began to distort, not in form, but in function. Their technology was no longer coherent. Their rituals no longer anchored light. Their leadership no longer served. And when a civilization forgets why it exists, collapse is inevitable. But the first signs were not cataclysmic. They were subtle, spiritual malaise, a loss of meaning, increased separation, decreased intuition. They stopped listening to the earth, to the stars, to the inner voice. They began to worship their own creations, to place trust in their systems, their machines, their intellect, rather than the living presence behind it all. It's easy to look at Atlantis and see a distant myth, but look closer, listen carefully. Do you not hear the same forgetting now? A world that chases more and feels less, that builds taller but sees shallower, that speaks louder but remembers less. The fall of Atlantis wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a civilization outgrows its spirit. And the warning was never in the flood, it was in the forgetting. Because when you forget what you are, you stop protecting what matters. And when the soul goes quiet, it takes the world with it. Atlantis didn't vanish, it fractured. The continent may have been swallowed, but its essence wasn't. When the waters rose, when the earth shook, when the sky fell, not everyone was lost. Some knew it was coming. The initiates, the priesthood, the keepers of memory, those who still lived in alignment with the law of one. They weren't just survivors, they were seeders, and their mission was clear. Carry what could not be destroyed, not the structures, not the systems, but the sacred, the codes, the frequencies, the truths that live in geometry, breath, story, and stone. According to Edgar Casey, After the final destruction, these initiates scattered to Egypt, to the Yucatan, to Peru, to the Himalayas, and to forgotten islands now buried by time. They didn't rebuild Atlantis. That was never the plan. They encoded it in temples, in myths, in symbols so ancient they now look like art. But they weren't decorative. They were directional. Guides for those who could still feel. In Egypt, they laid the foundation for what would become the mystery schools. The priests of Thoth, the architect of wisdom, carried Atlantean knowledge into the blueprints of pyramids and texts like the Emerald Tablets. Thoth, or Tehuti, was said to be an Atlantean himself, a being who transcended lifetimes to preserve truth across ages. In Mesoamerica, the memory took form as Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a bringer of knowledge and harmony. In India, fragments of Atlantean wisdom echoed through the Vedas, with references to flying machines, subtle energy systems, and sound-based creation. These were not coincidences. They were convergences. Atlanteans didn't flee. They planted seeds of remembrance across continents, across time. They knew humanity would forget, that empires would rise, rewrite, and erase, that dogma would replace knowing, that temples would become tourist sites, that sacred geometry would become architecture, that mantras would become music. But they also knew the soul remembers, and so they left just enough. A glyph, a myth, a resonance in stone, a pattern in sound, because they weren't just preserving information, they were preserving vibration. They encoded memory into form, into art, into language that only the awakened would hear. You can find them if you know where to look. The eye of Horus in Egyptian reliefs, the spiral patterns of petroglyphs, the perfect ratios in sacred structures, aligned to stars older than history books allow. This is the secret of the survivors. They didn't try to convince the world. They encoded a signal for the few who would feel it later. And now, you are feeling it. Because the future they seeded wasn't a place. It was a person. You. Egypt remembers. Even if the world has forgotten, Egypt remembers. Not the Egypt of textbook timelines or tourist pyramids, but the Egypt beneath. The Egypt whispered in symbols, buried in stone, encoded in initiation. The Egypt that inherited the pulse of Atlantis. When the final cataclysm shook Atlantis, the surviving initiates carried their knowledge east. And where they landed, they did not speak loudly. They built, they aligned, they encoded. They understood what was coming, not just floods and fire, but empire. They knew memory would be hunted, so they buried it in form, in vibration, in stone. The pyramids of Giza were not tombs. That theory has never held under scrutiny. No hieroglyphs inside, no mummies found, no funerary markings, just angles so precise, alignment so perfect, that even today, with our modern tools, we cannot explain how they were built. Not truly. The Great Pyramid is aligned within a fraction of a degree to true north. Its dimensions encode the golden ratio. Its position triangulates with other sacred sites around the world, forming a global geometric grid. This is not random. This is resonance. It is Atlantean. The teachings of the mystery schools, those that trained initiates in the ways of vibration, breath, intention, geometry, did not originate in dynastic Egypt. They were preserved there, protected by priests who remembered. Passed through names like Thoth, Imhotep, Isis. These were not myths. These were carriers, architects of frequency. The Sphinx itself may be far older than mainstream history allows. scholar John Anthony West and geologist Robert Schoch argued that water erosion on the Sphinx suggests a construction date long before Egypt's known arid climate, perhaps over 10,000 years ago. This would place it precisely within the timeline of a post-Atlantean migration. And why a lion? Why face it east toward the rising sun on the equinox? Because it guards something, not just stone chambers, but memory. The Sphinx doesn't speak in words. It speaks in silence, in alignment, in presence. It is a sentinel of an age we were told never existed. And yet, there it stands. Every temple in ancient Egypt was a vibration. Every chamber, a frequency. Initiates didn't just learn facts. They were transformed through sound, through breath, through geometry that tuned the body to the divine. This was the continuation of Atlantis, but it was also the beginning of its concealment, because as empire rose, memory became dangerous. The mystery schools were forced underground, the teachings encoded in allegory, the language disguised to survive. But Egypt remembers, and so do you, because when you stand before the Sphinx, or run your hands along the stones of a pyramid, something ancient moves in you, something wordless, a pulse, a recognition. That feeling isn't imagination, it's resonance. Memory doesn't fade on its own. It's erased, not with time, but with strategy, because truth is a threat, not to people, but to power. And so, when the great empires rose, they didn't just conquer land, they conquered memory. They knew the real battle wasn't over territory, it was over consciousness. So they burned what couldn't be controlled. The Library of Alexandria, gone in flames. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls destroyed. Not just literature, not just science, but esoteric knowledge. Texts from Egypt, Sumer, India, Atlantis, compiled by initiates and preserved for centuries. Gone. Multiple fires, spanning decades, under Roman rule and Christian rise. And with every flame, another portal closed. The same happened in China, under Qin Shi Huang. Thousands of ancient philosophical texts burned to unify the narrative. In Mesoamerica, Spanish conquistadors ordered the burning of Mayan codices. Out of hundreds, only 4 survived. This was not coincidence. This was orchestration. Because sacred knowledge doesn't just teach, it liberates. It tells you the gods are within you, that healing is a frequency, that the soul is eternal, that time is cyclical, and that empire is a shadow play. And when people know that, they stop obeying fear. So the stories had to change. Gods became demons. Initiates became heretics. Mystics became madmen. And symbols of power, the serpent, the eye, the spiral, were inverted, twisted into signs of evil. But the truth was never evil. It was simply inconvenient, too powerful, too pure, too hard to control. So it had to be silenced. The temples of Egypt, once schools of initiation, became monuments, empty of context, separated from their cosmology, interpreted through colonial eyes and reductionist science. No longer centers of activation, but artifacts for observation. What couldn't be destroyed was diluted, and what couldn't be diluted was hidden. Secret societies, underground lineages, whispered mantras, hidden chambers beneath desert stone. The teachings never died, but they went dark, waiting for the right souls to remember. But the forgetting worked. It fractured timelines. It replaced remembrance with religion, mystery with dogma, embodied wisdom with obedience, because a world that forgets its origins can be shaped into anything. And that's what happened. History was rewritten, and those who questioned it were erased too. But memory is not so easily killed. It leaves residue in symbols, in dreams, in your own body, which still responds to sacred sound, to geometry, to presence, even if you don't know why. The erasure was deep, but not total, because the soul always keeps a copy. There was a time when myth was sacred. It wasn't entertainment. It wasn't fiction. It was memory, encoded, protected, wrapped in symbol to survive empire. But something changed. When power couldn't destroy the truth, it diluted it. When it couldn't silence memory, it smothered it in ridicule. And so, the myth was rebranded, not as ancient truth, but as fantasy. Atlantis, Lemuria, the Garden of Eden. All stories, we're told. Just stories. Atlantis, they say, was a metaphor, a cautionary tale invented by Plato, even though he said clearly this was no invention. This was history passed down by Egyptian priest to Solon, to Critias, to him. A lineage of remembrance. But the word myth was redefined. What once meant sacred story became synonymous with lie. This wasn't an accident, it was a tactic. Because when truth is too powerful to erase, you laugh at it instead. Ridicule is more effective than censorship. It makes the seeker doubt. It makes the witness stay silent. That's what they did to Atlantis, to the serpent, to the divine feminine, to mystics, to those who remembered too much, too clearly, too loudly. They weren't disproven, they were discredited, and that's how empires protect themselves, by turning the sacred into spectacle, by calling the ancient irrelevant, by making those who question look like fools. But here's the irony, the myths survived, because while they buried the facts, they couldn't stop the stories, and stories know how to wait. Myth became the carrier of truth too volatile for textbooks. It slipped through the cracks, worn into lullabies, inscribed in glyphs, spoken in dreams, told by fireside to children who would grow up feeling something they could never explain. This is why every culture has a flood myth, a golden age myth, a tale of collapse, rebirth, and the gods who once walked among us. These aren't inventions, they're fragments of one story told 1,000 ways. From Plato's Atlantis to the Hopi's third world, from Kumari Kandam to Lemuria, from Zep-Tepi to Eden. Each is a mirror, each is a memory. Each was dismissed as legend, so no one would ask what they were really pointing to. But the soul still knows. And if you've ever felt a myth stir something deeper than logic, that's not imagination, that's inheritance. Because the real power of myth is that it survives forgetting, even when you don't believe it, even when you've been told to laugh, even when history books close the door. Myth slips through the cracks and waits for the moment you stop asking if it's true and start asking why they tried so hard to convince you it wasn't. The code was never lost, it was hidden. Not in vaults, not in buried scrolls, but in plain sight, in pattern, in language, in the spiral of a shell, the angle of a pyramid, the symbol etched in stone, worn into rings, whispered in dreams. The initiates of Atlantis knew what was coming. They saw the storm of empire, the coming flood, not of water, but of distortion. So they encrypted their knowledge, not with secrecy, but with resonance. They encoded truth in shapes, in sound, in stories, in the proportions of the body, in the math of the stars. Because they understood something modern science is only beginning to rediscover, that the universe is built on frequency, And frequency is pattern, and pattern is memory. This is sacred geometry, the divine architecture behind all creation, the flower of life, the Fibonacci spiral, the golden ratio. These aren't abstractions, they are maps, keys, the DNA of reality. You see them in nature, in the petals of a rose, the chambers of a nautilus shell, the orbits of planets, the human face. This is not coincidence, it's coherence. The Egyptians, inheritors of the Atlantean stream, built with these codes. The pyramids are not just aligned to the stars, they're constructed on principles that mirror the geometry of the cosmos. Pi, phi, light and shadow, vibration and form. Temples were designed not just to be seen, but to be felt. Walk into a true sacred site, and your body responds. Your breath deepens, your senses heighten. That's not magic, it's mathematics encoded with soul. The same is true of symbols. The eye of Horus, the Ankh, the spiral, the triangle. These were not logos, they were tools, activation devices for those who remembered how to see. Even the Hebrew Kabbalah, the Sri Yantra of India, the medicine wheels of the First Nations, all carry within them the same geometry, the same symmetry, the same source. Because truth always returns. And those who sought to protect it knew this, so they didn't try to save the system. They saved the pattern. Because the pattern is eternal. It survives fire, it survives translation, it survives forgetting. And it waits until one day a person sees a symbol and feels something stir, a spiral that draws them in, a chant that moves more than sound, a story that feels older than time. And that feeling is the code activating. You were never meant to remember with your mind. You were meant to remember through resonance, because the code isn't just around you, it's inside you, waiting for alignment, waiting for presence, waiting for now. You don't have to travel to ancient ruins to find the temple, because the temple was never meant to be found. It was meant to be remembered. And the moment you begin to tune in, you realize you are the temple now. Your body is not random. It's sacred architecture. The ancients knew this. From Egypt to India to the high mountains of Peru, mystery schools taught that the human form mirrors the cosmos, that the spine is the staff of light, that the breath is the carrier of spirit, that the heart, not the brain, is the true generator of electromagnetic frequency. You're not just flesh and blood, you're sound and light, geometry and breath, memory and intention, layered into form. The chakras are not New Age decoration, they're ancient circuitry, energy centers mapped in the Vedas over 5,000 years ago, echoing what Atlanteans once taught. That frequency moves through us, that consciousness flows in waves, that when we align our internal current, we unlock something dormant, something divine. Your breath is a tuning fork. Your voice is an instrument. Your thoughts are frequencies that ripple through your cells. The modern world teaches you to ignore this, to outsource healing, to numb sensation. But deep within your form, the sacred geometry still pulses. The Fibonacci spiral traces the curl of your DNA. The golden ratio shapes your face, your fingers, your very frame. Your blood hums with electromagnetic charge. Your nervous system, a crystalline web of awareness, lights up like a grid every time you meditate, pray, or feel love without resistance. You are not a container for spirit. You are spirit made visible. And when you walk in alignment, you become the temple reborn. The Atlanteans built with this in mind. Their temples were designed to mimic the human body. Chambers aligned with chakras, entrances facing solar gates. halls that echoed at specific tones to activate pineal resonance. And now, with those structures mostly gone or misunderstood, the sacred blueprint returns where it never left, inside of you. Every mantra you speak with intention, every breath taken in presence, every time you silence the noise and tune inward, you light the grid again. You rebuild the temple, not in stone, but in soul. And that's what they never expected. That even if they erased the monuments, even if they burned the scrolls, even if they silenced the priesthoods, they couldn't extinguish the spark placed inside the human form. You don't need to find the sacred site. You are the sacred site. And the moment you remember that, Atlantis begins to rise again, not as a place, but as a presence, and it begins with you. This isn't your first life, and if the word Atlantis resonates deep in your bones, this may not be your first fall, because some of us were there, not in fantasy, not in dream, but in presence. We walked through those temples. We touched the crystals as they hummed with light. We spoke the ancient names of the stars. We lived in a time where the divine was not a mystery, it was daily reality. And when the collapse came, we felt it, not just in the earth beneath our feet, but in the shattering of our purpose. But the story didn't end there, because the soul is not bound by disaster. It returns, again and again, until the lesson is complete. Many esoteric traditions speak of this, that souls return not just to grow, but to restore. That when a civilization falls out of harmony, those who carried the light are reborn to help carry it back. Edgar Cayce referred to these souls as reincarnated Atlanteans. He said they would return during times of transition, especially now, and not all as teachers. Many would arrive quiet, sensitive, hidden, but with memory, just beneath the surface. You may not remember the details, but the pull is there. A fascination with ancient ruins, a longing for something more aligned, a sense that you came here to do something, even if you can't yet name it. You felt out of place in this world, not because you're broken, but because your memory is older than this society. You weren't made for systems that drain the soul. You were made to restore the frequency of truth. And maybe that's your mission, to remember, to reawaken, to rebuild, not with stone, but with energy, with intention, with presence. Your path may not be loud, it may not be recognized, but it is sacred. Because every time you choose alignment over distortion, every time you speak from soul rather than fear, you're doing what was once done in Atlantis before the fall. You are repairing the field. You are activating the grid. You are completing the cycle. This time with awareness. This time without collapse. Because the return of the Atlantean soul is not about nostalgia. It's about evolution. And if you're here, if you feel this, you're not imagining it. You are not new to this. You are returning. And this time you remember why. You felt it. That inner knowing that this isn't your first time around. The familiar sense that you've walked this path before, yet you can't quite place where or when. It's not just a feeling, it's a knowing. A deep current running through you, sometimes rising up like an ancient tide, reminding you that there's more at play here. You are not alone in this awareness. There are others too. The sensitives, the seers, the silent ones. You know them, and you know they know you. The sensitives are the ones who feel the subtle shifts. They walk into a room and immediately sense the energy, the undercurrents that others miss. It's not always comfortable. The overstimulation, the energy of people, places, events. It can feel overwhelming at times, but it's a gift. The gift of tuning into the vibrational frequency of the world and recognizing the disharmony where others don't. Then there are the seers, those who glimpse beyond the veil, those who felt time bend and stretch, those who dream in visions of what was, what could be, what is waiting just beneath the surface of this reality. They have memories of ancient wisdom, from a time when the sacred and the mundane were one. They are the dreamers who are awake even when they sleep, carrying fragments of forgotten knowledge, calling you to remember what's hidden. And then, the silent ones. They walk quietly through the world, not because they don't have a voice, but because their presence speaks louder than words. They've learned that true power lies in stillness, in the ability to listen to the subtle whispers of the soul, to the hum of the earth beneath their feet, to the rhythm of the stars. They know they don't need to shout to be heard. Their silence is their statement, their presence a beacon. And sometimes they come with no outward expression of their purpose, yet they carry the frequency of change. They were born to shift the outcome, but in their own time. These souls are the Atlanteans who have returned, the ones who once held the keys to divine knowledge, to the mastery of frequency and vibration. They were the ones who understood the energy that flowed through all things, and how to harness it for healing, creation, and evolution. And now they're back, scattered across the earth, awakening in waves, quietly stirring the waters of this world. You too may have been one of them. Maybe you've been sensing something for a long time. The stirrings of ancient memories, the flickers of déjà vu that haunt your thoughts, or that quiet pull inside, telling you that you've been here before, and this time you must shift the outcome. This time the fool won't come. The sensitives, the seers, and the silent ones. They are the awakening Atlanteans, returning not just to relive the past, but to rewrite it, to recalibrate the very frequencies that sustain this reality. They have come to heal, to remember, and to guide. And if you are reading these words, if you are hearing this call, then you too are part of the lineage. You too are here to help shift the outcome. You've been here before, and you are remembering. You were never meant to learn this the way you've been taught. Not through memorization, not through doctrine, not through someone else's version of truth, because the real teachings were never outside you. They were always encoded within. This is not about learning, it's about remembering. There is ancient knowledge asleep in your blood, in your breath, in your bones. And the more you seek it out there, the further you drift from where it truly lives. Your soul didn't forget, only your mind did. And now, piece by piece, the remembering is awakening, not in the form of information, but through resonance, through symbols that stir something deep in you, through songs you've never heard, but already know. This is how soul memory works. You encounter a practice you've never tried, but it feels like coming home. You hold a crystal in your palm, and your body relaxes, as if it recognizes an old friend. You hear a chant in a language you don't speak, yet your heart slows, your eyes well up, and a forgotten part of you sighs in relief. This is not coincidence, this is cellular memory. Modern science is beginning to catch glimpses of this truth. Epigenetics shows us that experience is stored in the body, that memory lives beyond the brain. And the mystics knew it long before the lab, in the Vedas, in Hermetic texts, in the teachings of the Gnostics and the Essenes. All point to the same truth. You are not starting from scratch. You are reawakening a lineage. The Atlanteans didn't just pass on teachings through books or temples. They passed them on through soul contracts, DNA lineages, energetic codes, and those codes are buried in you. You felt it, the magnetic pull toward energy work, the urge to protect what's sacred, even when you can't explain why. The way your hands move in meditation, without being taught, the way your intuition knows before your mind can catch up. You've done this before, and no one can teach you what you already are. So the real path is not about collecting more knowledge, it's about clearing the noise that's buried the wisdom already within. The trauma, the programming, the distractions, the doubt. Because once that clears, the soul speaks, the hands remember, the voice reactivates, the energy flows. You're not here to be a student of the old ways. You're here to embody them again. This is what the Atlanteans left behind. Not just relics, but a ripple. A living current that travels through soul to soul, lifetime to lifetime, waiting for the moment when someone like you would finally stop searching and start listening. Because you don't need to learn this. You came to remember. The Atlantean mind doesn't awaken through effort. It doesn't respond to pressure, to facts, to force. It returns in stillness, in silence, in the spaces in between. Because what you're trying to remember can't be grasped with thought. It lives beneath the mind, in a place thought can never reach. In Atlantis, the mind wasn't the master. It was the servant of soul. Intellect was honored, but only when balanced by intuition. Reason was used, but never at the cost of resonance. Knowledge was sacred, but wisdom was found in stillness. The Atlanteans understood that presence is a state of power, not passive, not idle, but fully tuned in, not focused outward, but inward, rooted, coherent, vibrationally aligned. This is how they tuned the body to frequency. This is how they channeled light into sound, and sound into healing, not through complex machines, but through consciousness that knew how to listen. Stillness was not emptiness. It was the portal, the calibration space, the field in which the forgotten codes could reassemble themselves inside the soul. You can't force this remembering. You can only allow it. When you slow down, when you breathe deeply, when you stop chasing and start listening, something ancient begins to stir. Not a voice, but a vibration. Not words, but waves. And those waves begin to rearrange you. They bring coherence where there was chaos, clarity where there was confusion. They realign your internal compass to a frequency that doesn't need proof because it feels like home. Modern science is only beginning to map what mystics have always known. HeartMath Institute research shows that the heart's electromagnetic field can synchronize with the brain's rhythms. That intuition is real. That coherence is measurable. That presence is a bioelectrical phenomenon. Not just a mood, but a signal. The Atlanteans lived in this signal, and you are returning to it now. This is why meditation matters, not as a trend, but as a technology, a remembering device. This is why you're being drawn to silence, to nature, to long walks without your phone, to the breath. Because in those quiet moments, you begin to hear the deeper music of your being. And in that music, the Atlantean mind reawakens, not with a roar, but with a pulse, a hum, a recognition. You've tried thinking your way to answers. Now try listening. Try being. Because what's coming through you is not something new, it's something ancient. And it doesn't need to be understood. It needs to be felt. And that feeling only arrives in stillness. You were taught to believe that healing is a ladder, that growth moves upward, step by step, neatly, that if you fall back, you failed, that if you feel lost again, you must have done something wrong. But the soul doesn't work that way. The path isn't a climb, it's a spiral. In Atlantis, this was deeply understood. Life was not seen as a straight line with a destination. It was a return through cycles, seasons, and spirals. Again and again, but never the same. Each return takes you deeper. Each loop reveals more. Not because you're stuck, but because you're ready. Pain revisits, not to punish, but to peel. Grief returns, not to drown you, but to soften you. You don't revisit wounds because you failed. You revisit them because you're strong enough now to face what you couldn't before. This is the spiral path, a sacred, powerful, sometimes agonizing rhythm of becoming. And it can feel messy. You think you've released something, and then it comes back. You think you've moved on, and then the memory hits. But if you look closely, it's never exactly the same. Your response is different. Your awareness is sharper. Your compassion is deeper. That's growth, not in straight lines, but in circles, golden spirals, Fibonacci arcs, the very blueprint of the universe. It's how galaxies spin, how shells are formed, how your DNA coils. The spiral is not chaos, it's divine intelligence. And so is your journey. The Atlanteans built their temples according to these spirals. Initiation paths were curved, not straight. Lessons were taught in cycles, not checklists. The ancients knew that to truly embody wisdom, it had to be revisited, lived through, felt again and again, until it became you. This is why your healing repeats, not to torture you, but to transform you. Each time the pain rises, it offers a new layer. Each time the shadow appears, it holds a new key. You are not regressing, you're refining, and there's no final step, no ultimate arrival, because awakening isn't a destination, it's a resonance. And each time you spiral through, you come back changed. You speak differently, you breathe differently, you love differently. That's the real evolution. It doesn't look like constant success. It looks like returning with more grace. So when you find yourself in familiar pain, pause. Ask yourself, what new layer is here? What haven't I seen yet? What truth am I ready to hold now? And then breathe, because you're not failing, you're spiraling. And every spiral is sacred, especially the ones that hurt the most. They don't need to chain you anymore. They don't need to burn the scrolls or shatter the temples. All they need is to keep you distracted, because if you're always busy, you'll never remember who you are. The modern world is not neutral. It was designed, built layer upon layer, to pull your attention outward, to flood your senses, to exhaust your intuition. Not by accident, but by design. Because when you're constantly scrolling, comparing, performing, surviving, you stop listening, you stop feeling, you stop hearing the voice inside you that remembers everything. And that's the real threat, your awareness, your presence, your power. Because a present human cannot be manipulated, a conscious soul cannot be controlled. A person who sees, truly sees, cannot be programmed. This is why the Atlantean codes were buried. This is why memory was mythologized, turned into fantasy. And this is why today, you are bombarded with noise, algorithms designed to hijack your nervous system, advertising built on lack and longing, endless entertainment to numb the ache, 1,000 tiny hooks dragging your focus away from the one place it's dangerous to go. Inward. Because inward is where it begins. The remembering, the reactivation, the return. They don't fear your opinions, they fear your stillness. They don't care what you believe, as long as you keep scrolling. Because in the quiet, in the breath, in the sacred space of now, you become sovereign again. And that terrifies them. The ones who profit from your disconnection. The ones who built empires on your forgetfulness. The ones who rewrote history to make you think Atlantis was a myth and your intuition a glitch. But here's the truth. When you unplug, when you turn down the noise, when you walk outside without your phone, when you breathe like your soul depends on it, you begin to see, not just with your eyes, but with your whole being. You start to recognize the patterns, the manipulations, the distortions. And beyond that, you begin to feel the real you, the one that remembers the frequencies of truth, the resonance of sacredness, the harmony that once pulsed through Atlantis like a song. That's what they fear. Not rebellion, but remembrance. So they distract you. Because if you ever remembered fully, if even a few of you did, this entire illusion would crack open like a shell. And what would pour out is light. The light they tried to bury. The light that lives in you still, waiting. People speak of Atlantis as if it might rise again from the ocean floor. As if somewhere beneath the waves lies a sunken kingdom waiting to be excavated. They look for ruins, for lost stones, for hidden coordinates. But they're searching in the wrong direction. Atlantis is not returning through land. It's returning through you. This is not a geological event. It's a vibrational one. Atlantis was never just a place. It was a frequency, a state of consciousness, a civilization encoded with harmony, presence, and sacred intelligence. And that resonance doesn't need a continent to return. It needs a soul that's awake. The real return is not beneath the ocean. It's beneath the noise. It's rising not from tectonic plates, but from memory, from energy, from the stillness that lives underneath your distractions. And it's already happening. When you choose presence over performance, when you choose coherence over chaos, when you start feeling more than thinking, you're tuning to it, you're matching its frequency, you're becoming the new temple. Atlantis isn't rising in the news, it's rising in your nervous system, in your breath, in the way your body relaxes when you step into nature, in the way you cry for no reason when you hear a chant in a forgotten tongue, in the way you feel pulled towards symbols you don't understand, but your soul does. The myths of a golden age were never just history, they were prophecy. And the prophecy was never about time, it was about vibration. When enough souls begin to resonate with harmony again, not perfection, but alignment, the veil lifts, the illusion weakens, the false systems start to shake. Because Atlantis didn't vanish by chance. Its fall was a collapse in consciousness. And so its return must be a rise in consciousness. This is why you're awakening. This is why you're drawn to these teachings. This is why the old world feels unbearable and the new one irresistible. You are not broken. You are remembering a frequency. You are a tuning fork for a civilization long thought lost. And every act of presence, every moment of awareness, every breath that brings you back to yourself is a stone laid in the foundation of the new Atlantis. Not an empire, not a nation, but a network of souls, of lights, of silent reactivations. You are not waiting for Atlantis to rise. It's waiting for you to vibrate high enough, to become still enough, to awaken that ancient resonance that was buried not in water, but in you. The Atlanteans didn't leave behind maps. They left behind memory, codes, seeds of frequency waiting for one thing, your presence. Atlantis doesn't rise from the sea. It rises when you do. You don't need to wear a robe. You don't need to chant in ancient tongues. You don't need to build a temple out of stone. You already are the temple, and every moment you are building Atlantis again, but not with architecture, with alignment. The grid isn't made of gold or crystal towers. It's made of choices, tiny, invisible, sacred choices. How you breathe when you're overwhelmed, how you speak when you're angry, how you pause before reacting. This is how the new Atlantis begins, not with trumpets, but with presence, because every breath taken in coherence rebuilds the frequency of harmony. Every act done with intention anchors a higher vibration into the field. The Atlanteans understood that reality is not just physical, it's vibrational. That every word, every movement, every thought shapes the grid. And now, so do you. Science is finally catching up. Quantum physics shows us that observation affects matter, that energy fields respond to attention, that the coherence of the heart can influence the electromagnetic field around you. In other words, your inner state ripples out. It creates resonance. And when enough of us hold that resonance together, it becomes a new collective field, a new frequency map, a new earth. You may never see the impact, but your presence is wiring a network more powerful than any machine. A lattice of remembrance, a hum of coherence, a living library of sacred vibration. You are placing stones, not in soil, but in soul. And those stones form bridges between the forgotten and the remembered, between the fallen and the rising. Atlantis is not a destination. It's a frequency architecture, and your nervous system is one of its pillars. You felt it, the way your chest expands when you speak truth, the way your skin tingles when you hear sacred sound, the way your whole body says yes when you're in alignment. That's the grid activating. That's the blueprint coming online. And when you choose compassion over reaction, when you choose silence over performance, when you choose awareness over distraction, you send a signal, not just to those around you, but into the field itself. You recalibrate what's possible. You stabilize a space that others can step into. You become a portal, a living node in a lattice of light. This is how Atlantis returns. Not through excavation, through embodiment. You're not here to copy the past. You're here to live what it meant. And in doing so, you become something even greater than legend. You become the resonance of what was once forgotten, and now is being built again. In you, there is a revolution happening right now, but you won't see it on the news. It doesn't come with flags or fists. It doesn't scream or march or break glass. It whispers, it hums, it breathes. And if you're still enough, you can feel it. It begins in the smallest places. In the moment someone puts their phone down to look at the stars. In the way a child instinctively places their hand on a tree and listens. In the choice to feel your emotions fully instead of numbing them again. These are the sparks, the quiet fires, the revolution of consciousness. You don't have to shout to change the world. You just have to shift your frequency. Because energy is contagious. Coherence spreads, and when one person becomes centered, others feel it. It's not magic, it's resonance. When your nervous system calms, it offers others permission to do the same. When you speak from presence instead of performance, the room changes. You don't have to convince. You don't have to convert. You just have to be. That's what terrifies the old systems, not rebellion, but radiance. Because radiance isn't reactive. It doesn't fight the dark. It simply shines, and in doing so, dissolves what cannot exist in light. The quiet ones, the grounded ones, the sensitive, still aware souls walking through chaos without adding to it. They are the real revolution. They're not trending, they're not viral, they're not loud, but they are everywhere, and they're waking up. One meditation, one choice, one breath at a time. This is not about perfection, it's about presence. The Atlanteans once lived this truth, not through domination, but through resonance. Their power wasn't in their weapons, it was in their harmony. That's what we are remembering now, that you can dismantle systems without screaming, that you can shift entire fields without being seen, that your awareness, tuned, quiet, rooted, is a force more powerful than you know. And sometimes you will be misunderstood. People will think you're passive, that you don't care, that you should speak louder, fight harder, move faster. But you've seen what happens when people fight with no center. You've felt what happens when people run without presence. The real change comes from those who stay still long enough to hear the earth speak, long enough to remember why they came. You came to anchor a frequency, to walk differently, to live in a way that reminds others what's possible, without ever needing to say a word. This is how Atlantis returns, not with noise, but with presence, the kind that can't be faked and can't be ignored. You've been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, but the truth is, you're finely tuned. You were never meant to be numb. You are a frequency keeper, a sensor, a soul born into this moment not to adapt to the noise, but to feel through it. And yes, sometimes that hurts, because in a world addicted to distraction, presence feels like pressure. In a world built on suppression, your emotions feel like rebellion. But they're not flaws, they're instruments, ancient tools of perception, not designed to be silenced, but played. Every tear carries data. Every wave of grief is a message. Every burst of joy is alignment. Your nervous system isn't broken, it's awake. And when you feel deeply, when you pick up on things no one else notices, when a room's energy affects your body before words are even spoken, that's not weakness, that's memory. You are remembering a time when feeling was sacred, when intuition guided civilization, when emotion wasn't pathology, it was prophecy. The Atlanteans knew this. They trained their children to feel frequencies like languages. They didn't dismiss sensitivity. They honored it, because only the sensitive could tune to the deeper codes. Only the tuned could carry the truth. You came from that lineage. So of course, the modern world feels harsh. Of course, artificial light hurts your eyes. Of course, loud crowds drain you. Of course, you need silence more than screens. You were never meant to thrive in dissonance. You were meant to correct it by being the harmony. And that begins by reclaiming your sensitivity. Not as something to manage, but something to revere. Because your body is an antenna, your emotions are the signal, and the wisdom you carry is vibrational. When you cry, you're not breaking, you're cleansing. When you ache, you're not weak, you're receiving. When you pause because the world is too much, you're tuning to something deeper than words. You are not too much. You are exact. You are designed to feel because you are part of the grid that responds to energy. And when enough of you stop apologizing for that, when you stop numbing it, hiding it, medicating it, you begin to send out a new signal. A steady, sovereign signal. One that tells the universe, I remember, I feel, I trust. Because only those who feel fully can rebuild something sacred. The Atlantean return isn't powered by intellect, it's powered by sensitivity. So yes, be sensitive. Feel it all, because in those feelings are frequencies. And in those frequencies is the future. You are not too sensitive. You are precisely tuned for the mission. They didn't need to chain you. They just needed you to forget. Forget what you are. Forget where you came from. Forget the resonance that once guided entire civilizations. Because the most powerful prison is not made of bars. It's made of amnesia. Atlantis wasn't just buried in water. It was buried in mind, in distraction, in noise, in generations of programming that trained you to look outside yourself, to doubt your knowing, to trade inner truth for external approval. The system you were born into is not neutral. It's a construct, built to sever memory from soul. Schools that never mention intuition. Religions that replaced mysticism with fear. Governments that erased ancient knowledge and called it myth. A culture designed not to kill your soul, but to sedate it. Because a sedated soul doesn't rebel. It conforms. It consumes. It obeys. And for centuries, this worked. People forgot. And in forgetting, they surrendered. But now, the cracks are forming. Not in the earth, in the illusion. You're starting to remember things you've never been taught. You're feeling drawn to symbols you've never studied. You're hearing the call of a frequency buried in your bones. This isn't imagination. It's activation. The system can't stop it. Because the remembering doesn't come from books. It comes from the soul, from dream, from intuition, from that unexplainable knowing that says, I've lived this before, and I came back for this. That knowing is dangerous to the system, because it doesn't just wake you up, it makes you ungovernable. Not in a lawless way, but in a sovereign way. A way that can't be bribed, bought, or broken. That's why you're being bombarded, not just with information, with distortion. Algorithms, endless noise, dopamine loops, digital fog, all engineered not to teach you, but to keep you asleep. But the cracks are spreading. Even in the deepest layers of programming, souls are slipping through. Light is leaking in, and you're one of them. You didn't come here to fix the system. You came to outgrow it, to out-vibrate it, to remember so fully that your very presence becomes a rupture in the illusion. Because remembering is contagious. One awakened soul shifts the entire frequency. And when enough of us remember together, the system dissolves. Not in violence, in vibration. Because nothing artificial can survive in full presence. Nothing false can hold shape in full light. And nothing programmed can withstand the frequency of a soul that knows itself. So let the cracks form. Let the illusion tremble. Because this time, you're not forgetting. You're reawakening. You're remembering the code. And you're carrying the vibration that built Atlantis before and will build it again. From within. You think you're just making choices. What to say, what to eat, where to go, who to trust. But every one of those choices isn't just a decision, it's a frequency, it's a signal. You are not separate from the grid, you are the grid. And every time you choose presence over reaction, stillness over chaos, truth over comfort, you shift the field. You think your life is ordinary, but from the soul's view, it's a radiant transmitter. Each breath is a pulse. Each word is a ripple. Each act of courage codes the matrix with a new vibration. This is how Atlantis lived, not through grand structures or heroic acts, but through integrity, through the alignment between thought, word, and action. They understood that the outer world is always a reflection of the inner. And so do you. You may not be building temples, but you're building timelines. Every yes and every no writes new data into the collective field. That's why you're being called to more awareness now, not to impress anyone, but because your frequency matters. You've felt it, how one person's calm can settle a room, how one act of kindness can realign an entire day, how one moment of pause can interrupt generations of unconscious reaction. You are not small. You are a node of transformation, a point in the grid, a lighthouse pulsing codes into the dark. The ancient memory is rising not in text, but in you, in your decisions, in how you carry your energy when no one's watching. Even silence becomes a code. Even attention becomes a prayer. So be intentional. Not perfect, just present. When you cook with love, you code the food. When you speak with truth, you charge the air. When you walk barefoot on the earth with gratitude, you activate the old lines. This is not metaphor. This is resonance. And science is catching up. Studies in heart coherence, cymatics, and morphogenetic fields all confirm what the ancients knew. Consciousness influences reality. Intention imprints energy, and the field responds to frequency. So ask yourself, what are you broadcasting? Because you don't need a platform to be a transmitter. You are the platform, and your daily life is the message, even when it's messy, even when it's quiet, even when no one sees it. The codes are carried through your consistency. You came here not just to remember, but to encode the new. And every time you choose with love, you write another line into the new blueprint, a line only you can write, because only your soul has that signature. Only your life holds that frequency, and it's needed now more than ever. You didn't stumble into this lifetime. You didn't just happen to awaken now. You chose this moment, down to the breath. Your soul studied the timeline. It saw the density, the distortion, the disconnection. And still, it came, because it knew. It knew this would be the cycle of remembering, the return of codes, the reawakening of Atlantean light, not in temples made of stone, but in bodies made of stardust, in breath, in presence, in you. You were there once. You walked the crystal bridges. You sang with the harmonics of the earth. You knew how frequency shaped matter, and you remembered how to live without forgetting. But then the fall came, and you chose to return, not once, but across lifetimes, scattered through tribes and temples, learning, unlearning, anchoring the codes. Each incarnation, a fragment, each life, a note in the greater song. And now, in this one, the pieces converge. You feel it, the déjà vu that hits without warning, the symbols that seem to follow you, the synchronicities too precise to ignore. This is not coincidence. It's soul alignment. The old ones are returning, not just as memories, but as you, the sensitives, the seekers, the ones who never fit the mold because they weren't meant to. You weren't born to conform. You were born to reawaken what was buried. That's why the system tried to crush you early. Why you felt the weight of the world before you even had words. Why your emotions ran deeper than most could understand. You were carrying ancient codes in a modern world, and those codes are activating now. Not through force, but through frequency. The right book, the right dream, the right moment of stillness. And suddenly, a flood of remembering. You've always been surrounded by signs. You just weren't ready to see them until now. But your soul was. It timed this. It chose your birth, your family, your wounds, even your forgetfulness. Because that forgetfulness would make the remembering sacred. It's not too late. You're not behind. You're right on time. Because you're not here to escape the world. You're here to help rebuild it from the frequency up. You're not alone. Others like you are waking up across the planet, from different backgrounds, with different stories, but the same pulse, a heartbeat that echoes across timelines, a knowing that says, we've done this before, and this time we'll do it together. Atlantis was never just a city, it was a consciousness, and that consciousness is reassembling through you. You didn't miss your mission. You are the mission, so breathe. You're not late. You're not lost. You're arriving, exactly as planned. It's not in the headlines. It's not on the news. But look closer. The new Atlantis is already rising. Not through governments, not through fame or force, but through the breath of those who remember, in sacred circles, in whispered conversations, in digital spaces where souls find each other again after lifetimes apart. You felt it. That moment when you meet someone and know, we've done this before. That pull to places you've never visited, as if the land itself is calling your DNA. These aren't fantasies. They're frequencies reuniting. The Atlanteans didn't disappear. They dispersed. And now, scattered across continents and skin tones and timelines, they are remembering. Not all at once, not in spectacle, but in stillness. The new Atlantis is not made of marble. It's made of presence, of authenticity, of the choice, in every moment, to live as a bridge between earth and soul. You see it in the ones growing food with love. You see it in the mothers raising children to feel, not just to follow. In the healers who work with energy instead of just tools. In the artists channeling codes through color and sound. In the ones who would rather sit in silence than speak without truth. This is not performance, it's remembering. They may not call it Atlantis, they may not use the ancient names, but their vibration, it matches the memory. Communities are forming, not around dogma, but around resonance, not around hierarchy, but around shared remembrance. Each soul bringing a piece of the code, each presence anchoring a new layer of the grid. And when they come together, it hums. You feel it in your spine, in your chest, in the tears that rise without reason, because it is a reason. It's your soul saying, this is what we've been waiting for. These aren't utopias. They're experiments in harmony. They're imperfect, yes, because this is Earth, but the intention is pure, and the impact is real. This is how the new Atlantis rises, not with force, but with alignment. It's built in the unseen, in the decision to walk gently, to speak honestly, to choose presence over performance, even when no one's watching, because the foundation isn't material, it's vibrational, and you are part of it. Every time you listen to your intuition instead of your fear, you lay a stone. Every time you honor your energy instead of your schedule, you set a beam. Every time you create instead of consume, you raise the ceiling just a little higher. And when enough of us do this, not for credit, but from calling, the structure begins to glow. Atlantis returns, not from the ocean, but from within. This is not a story. It never was. It's a signal. And somehow, across timelines, lifetimes, and layers of forgetting, you heard it. Maybe it started as a whisper, a strange pull toward ancient names, a dream that felt more real than waking life, a longing you couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. That was the call to remember. Atlantis isn't a myth. It's not a fantasy. It's a frequency that your soul never stopped carrying. You didn't find this message by chance. You aligned with it because something inside you has always known. You were part of that story, not just as a witness, but as a builder, a teacher, a guardian of codes buried too deep for words, You've walked many lives since then, some in silence, some in fire, all of them carrying pieces of the blueprint. And now, in this lifetime, the pieces return, not as a history lesson, but as a remembrance. Your body remembers, your dreams remember, even your wounds. They remember. They've been guiding you, not as punishment, but as portals. Every heartbreak, every dark night, every moment you felt like giving up was an initiation. Because awakening isn't a comfort. It's a returning to everything you were told to forget, to everything they buried to control you. But they didn't erase it. Not really. Because what lives in the soul cannot be silenced. It can only sleep. And now, it's awake. You are awake. Not just to Atlantis, but to yourself. To the part of you that was never lost. Never broken. Never disconnected. You are the signal. You are the temple. You are the grid. This is not about going back. It's about going deeper, rebuilding from vibration, living in alignment, choosing presence over programming, love over fear, stillness over noise. This is how the new Atlantis returns, not as a place, but as a people, a pulse, a living memory, and it begins with you. Every time you trust the quiet knowing, every time you choose what's real, every time you remember who you are, you strengthen the signal, you recode the grid, you realign the earth, and that's why you're here. Not to escape the collapse, but to illuminate the rebirth. You didn't miss the mission, you answered it, you heard the call. And now, you remember. You didn't miss the mission. You answered it. You heard the call. And now, you remember. If this message stirred something ancient in you, share if the signal felt familiar. Comment below and let us know what you're remembering. If your soul whispered yes, like this video. Subscribe to stay on the path. And invite others who are ready to awaken. Because this isn't the end, it's the beginning of a deeper voyage. Welcome to the hidden voyage. Welcome home, soul whisper and soul creator. The hidden voyage. If this journey moves something in you, don't let it end in silence. Let it echo. Share it with someone still afraid to speak of death, still avoiding the mirror, still pretending time is infinite. Let this video be the hand you extend, the torch you pass, the doorway they didn't know they were seeking. Leave a comment, not just to speak, but to witness. What part of you is beginning to awaken? What have you been avoiding that now asks to be seen? And if your soul feels ready to keep walking, deeper, quieter, truer, then this is your place. Not just a channel, but a temple. Subscribe and join a circle of seekers who no longer run from the end because they've begun to live from it. We release these videos like offerings, each one a prayer, each one a mirror, each one a map to awaken before the end, to remember who you are beneath the name, to walk together toward what cannot die, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred step on the hidden voyage. Soul whisper and soul creator. The hidden voyage.